Hi, I'm Sarah Schatz, and you're listening to Kindle Curiosity, a podcast for curious souls where we explore the creative process. This is Season 2, Episode 1, and I am so excited to be back. If you missed the holiday episode, you may not have heard our exciting news. My husband and I are expecting our first baby in May of 2019. Or June, depending on when he decides to join us. So I've had a little bit of a slow start to the year. I'm trying to find the rhythm of the second trimester and my teaching job and the podcast. I have been cooking up some new exciting things for Patreon, and I am so happy to be back. So today's episode was actually recorded last year. It was meant to be part of season 1, but it's actually one of the longest interviews that I recorded. There was so much good stuff in there that I just wasn't able to edit it during the first trimester. So I saved it to start off season 2, and it is definitely one of my favorites. As a result, the timeline is a little bit off. So Ashley will mention grad school as if it's in the future, but she has already started. And if you hop over to her Instagram, you can follow along on her grad school adventure. But before I introduce you to Ashley, I have one more really exciting thing that I want to share. So over the break, I was kind of racking my brain about two different things. One, I really wanted to add something different to Patreon. And two, I have lists and lists of guests that I would love to have on the podcast, but I don't have the time to chat with everyone I would like, especially with that May due date looming. So I have hatched a bonus podcast. If you hop over to Patreon at patreon.com/SarahDSchatz, you can sign up to receive a bonus podcast called Tea Time every month. I'm really excited about the first few episodes. I have guests who are sharing their personal narratives, sharing tips with you. And our very first guest is Ray Amiette of ArtStew52. ArtStew52 is a free online community that you can join in on Instagram. Imagine if you're sitting in the Gryffindor common room at Hogwarts with a circle of friends who are all making and drawing and crocheting and knitting and crafting. That's kind of like the feeling that the Art Stew gives me. I've been participating in that community for about a year now, and I'm one of Ray's patrons on her Patreon, and she has some of the most creative and brilliant rewards. And so I've asked her for the first bonus episode to share some of her Patreon tips. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of that episode here.
The one thing you need in order to start a Patreon is just a handful of dutiful followers that make up your own personal community. This is why I think that every little bit of support helps. You get to know your audience, like those 4 or 5 people, so much better through Patreon.
If you'd like to listen to the whole thing, you can sign up at patreon.com/SarahDSchatz. It's just $5 a month for the extra podcast. And now, without any further ado, let's get to today's episode. Ashley Jane Lewis is a maker, baker, coder, and new media artist. She's also a makerspace lead and coding and robotics instructor. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I like to start by asking people what they were curious about growing up.
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, I was very curious. My parents were great in that they encouraged or almost forced that curiosity. We weren't really, my brother and I weren't allowed to watch like a ton of TV. We watched a fair amount, but we weren't allowed to be like in front of the TV all day. A lot of the times I would like have to moderate my time between like friends and family with a lot of mindfulness. Like my parents had this list on the fridge, like what are the levels of importance? And it's like school was level of important number 1, and then family, and then friends, and then like boyfriends or something silly like that. I was like 9, so it was a joke. But because of that, like school and family were a big part of what was kind of mandatory in our household. So they always asked us what we liked about school, and then found other opportunities for us to seek those interests after school. So we would spend a lot of time in I would spend a lot of time in Girl Guides, my parents would be like, you're not watching TV today. You and your brother are going to play in the park. And so my neighborhood friends and I would like play, and it would always be inventive, always be explorative. So we used to do things like make fabric dyes out of like the flowers in my parents' backyard. And then through that process, learn a whole bunch about like color and pigment and nature and all of those things just by happenstance. And my parents would do a lot of strategic play where they would make it so that like we would get a whole bunch of crafts, and then they would like put them in our hands and hope that we would learn something from them. So we got a lot of like science oriented crafts and things like that. But yeah, we went on tons of nature walks. I was really curious about nature and art. I really loved making things a lot as a kid. My dad worked in a wood shop. He had like a tiny little, I guess, like storage room turned into a wood shop in my house. So I would not help him, but mostly watch him do that a lot, which later on inspired a lot of the things that I do now. But yeah, I just remember a lot of play and a lot of just wonder as a kid. I had a really good childhood.
Sounds a lot like me. I grew up in the Girl Scouts. So what kind of things did you do in Girl Guides?
So many crafts. Oh my gosh. Like I have buckets and buckets of these crafts that I'm like, what do I even do with these now? But like so many crafts. I don't like, I did for so long, but it's kind of like a compressed memory. I don't really remember from like the divisions of like what year happened, what things happened in which years. But I do remember a ton of hot gluing. I loved hot gluing. I remembered lots of glitter, lots of fabric. I remember lots of songs. We went camping sometimes, which I wasn't like as into back then as I am now, but there were a lot of forests and creeks and ponds near my Girl Guide unit. So we would walk in those areas and do a lot of nature discovery and things like that.
And so how did those interests and curiosities lead to what you do now?
I think that the nature stuff, like I have a loving relationship with the Yukon. I went there 3 years ago. I fell in love. Like I'm for sure going to buy a home there. It's like the most magical. It's like Canada's Scandinavia. We don't even know. It's phenomenal. So I think a lot of that was a lot of the things that were nature oriented when I was young came out like they had like a gap in my early 20s where I did none of that stuff. And then it's all kind of resurged now, like with beekeeping and with my fascination with the Yukon and with a lot of like holistic methods for lifestyles. Like I do a lot of like canning and preserving. And I feel like those things that are more, I suppose, like folk oriented can largely be tied to a passion of like probably my grandmother, but also Girl Guides who fostered this kind of medium between the past and the present. So yeah, I think that those have come out in those ways. Like making things has never gone away, but it's certainly evolved, and it's evolved to take on more attributes of the stuff I used to make with as a kid. So for instance, right now I'm working on like a small art series where I built a loom in the workshop at work, and I'm making a small series of art pieces where I'm weaving data. So it's like a form of data visualization where you take like blocks of information and you choose a way to visualize it. And so weaving isn't something I've done, I don't know, maybe since Girl Guides, So that's like a huge, that's like maybe a decade and a half, between then and now. But it's come back in like full force. And then like working with my hands and hot gluing stuff is still a big passion of mine, I guess. But yeah, all of those things have come up. But the folk attribute I found to be like particularly at its peak when I was a kid in Girl Guides, and now like right now in my late 20s.
So how did you decide what to study in college, in undergrad?
Yeah, it was hard, really. I did well in almost all my courses. So it was really, I remember it being like a really big struggle to figure out what I really wanted to do, because I really liked biology, I really liked art, and I did a lot of concert band music as a high schooler as well. Yeah, and I like led an amnesty group and things like that. So activism was a part of it as well. So it was really challenging, and it wasn't helpful to talk to my teachers because each teacher just wanted me to pursue whatever they taught, which isn't helpful at all. But luckily I had always had more ties to art than I had with anything else. So I think like my parents really encouraged me to ask myself like what I couldn't live without, and art beyond all the other things was a part of that. So I took a year off after high school and did the Katimovic program. It was like founded by the Trudeaus. It's like this exchange where you travel all around Canada for free and you work in nonprofit organizations, and you get this, like, when I did it, you got this like large bursary at the end. It's the Conservative Party canceled that, but it's allegedly awesome, coming back. Though. Yeah, Justin Trudeau promised he would bring it back because his dad founded it. So we'll see what he does with that. But so I did that program after high school, which meant I had a whole year to kind of percolate on the things that I missed about school. And then when it came to applying for undergrad, I had kind of devised a series of things that I knew I really needed in my life. And I have to like attribute that all to my parents' guidance. Like I was just like a kid who was like, I like everything. Like I left to my own devices, I probably would have never made a decision, but they were like really intent on like honing me into something. Yeah. So I chose to do the new media program at Ryerson. I applied to a whole bunch. I got into like a bunch of schools, but it was like really the only program that seemed to speak to the Jane of all traits that I felt that I was. It was an arts-based program through the medium of technology. So it taught you how to code, it taught you how to work with websites, it taught you how to do video work, it taught you how to work with electronics and robotics. And truthfully, a lot of those things I had seen my parents like dabble in. And so they didn't feel, I mean, coding aside, everything else, I feel like I'd seen them dabble in. They taught you how to like work in physical fabrication as well and work with power tools. And so it wasn't scary to see those words, even though I didn't know how to do those things at all. I had just been exposed to people who also didn't know how to do those things, but tried to do those things. And so having it be a BFA at its undercurrent, I felt like it was the best choice for me. It felt like a really like wide spectrum of things to learn. And I'm really happy that I chose that program. It was really good for me. I really loved it.
So now I'm a little bit curious about your parents, because they're a really big influence, and you mentioned that they've done some of this stuff. So do you want to talk a little bit about them?
So my dad is a millwright mechanic. For like, I don't know, maybe 2 decades, he worked for Dare Foods, which meant that he like designed and maintained the machinery that Dare used to make cookies and candy, which was fun. I was never allowed to go on Take Your Kid to Work Day there, so I don't have a lot to say about what that place is truly like. But what I do know is that he was able to take home free cookies and candy all the time. So we had an endless supply of them. It was like a whole room in our basement that was just overloaded with cookies and candy, and everyone wanted to sleep over at my house, and it was great. And my mom is she's a accountant for a children's mental health association. But both of them, they really live like in a positive way. They really live like divided lives, in that like their work stays at work and their home is like totally different. So like I think my dad has like some crossover skills where he because he worked in like industrial design, he knows how to like build things. But my parents, like, they laid down all our hardwood floor in our house. My dad built our bathrooms like from nothing. Like the house was brand new when they bought it, so that it came with like no balcony, but like a doorway to a death drop, basically. So he built a balcony. They built a shed. They're avid gardeners, so they have like a really elaborate garden. So anyway, so I saw 2 people at all times throughout my childhood decide to do something with no previous knowledge. So it's not like they were trained to be contractors or renovators. They have no previous knowledge about that, but they would watch design shows and look at library magazines about it, and then like decide that was how they were going to approach something. And they just are, I guess, very artistic and executed it like without a lot of correction. Like, well, at least that's what it seemed as a kid. I don't know what really happened, to be honest. But anyway, so they were always making stuff like all the time. And I had my mom's mother, my grandmother, who's on my British side of the family, she lived in the house as well, and she would like bake a lot. And so I would see like her try new recipes and stuff. So realistically, the 3 adults who lived in my house were at all times like researching in an informal way, like going through books, like flipping through informational TV shows, and like jotting down notes. And like my dad would draw up plans, and then they had like all these little power tools, so they would just like build things all the time. And it wasn't really associated to what they did at work, but this is what they are passionate about, I think even more so than what they do during the day. At the time, it felt very normal, but as an adult, I've grown to learn that like not all people have parents who do that. Some do. Some of the people in my program did, but not everybody does. And so like, I think that it made me grow up with this, like this freedom of learning. Like I didn't have a lot of worry about trying new things. And I was like, oh, well, I could just learn how to do that. Like, here's beekeeping. There's a novel idea. I love bees. Like I grew up with a lot of nature. It'd be great to learn how to beekeep. And then it would just be like, let's go see if there's a class. Let's go see if there's a book at the library. Like, it's like, it was a lot of that. And I think all of that led to like I got my part-time while I was working. I got my baking certificate at George Brown because I was just like, hey, I've reached max capacity. Like I have a bookshelf behind me full of cookbooks. I've reached everything I can do on my own. So I'm going to go seek professional training and see how much further I can go with this passion of mine. And my parents really encouraged that and really demonstrated that. And only now am I recognizing that. Like I had for the first time a conversation with them on the phone where I'm like, hey, like, I think I have to thank you for everything that I do. Like it's hard to really see that as a kid, these demonstrations of stuff you grow on to be comfortable doing and being. But that's who they were that's who they are all like throughout my whole life. So they still do that. What are they building right now? They're building they want to like redo a whole bunch of things in our backyard, but they want to build a beehive like from scratch. Like they're into beekeeping now as a result. So so they're pretty cool in that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know I got a lot of my creative curiosity from my mom. She sews and she was their Girl Scout leader. So every week she was coming up with a new craft and testing it on us before she did it with the troop and going camping and all that fun stuff. So,
oh man, that's awesome.
I was also homeschooled. So we did a lot of what you are describing, but it was in the bracket of homeschooling.
Right. Cool.
So it's really interesting to hear that from parents that weren't homeschooling. And I love how they have, like, not to harp on your parents, but it's kind of fascinating because they have this whole creative, curious identity outside of their day jobs, which I think a lot of people feel like the stuff that they do that they're not paid for doesn't have value. Right. And so that was I really enjoyed. Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to see that. I think it's like we're particularly now in such a culture where everything you do not only has to have value, but has to have like a monetary value. It's not even like, is it a valuable use of my time? It's like, will this make me money? Which is an unfortunate redefinition of hobby or redefinition of like side project or interest or anything like that. As a result, I think we burn out a lot faster because everything we do has to have such grandiose purpose, so it's tough.
Right. I've talked about this in the podcast before, that you do something and someone sees that you can create a certain thing, and the first thing they say is, oh, you could sell that.
Yeah, exactly.
But that doesn't have to be, that's not the only thing that you can create for.
Right, exactly. Absolutely. And the pressures of those things become astronomical. I also think that it's like when you begin to sell things, this isn't to dissuade anyone who sells the things that they make on the side, but like if you're doing it for fun and only for fun, but convinced by others that you should sell it, all of a sudden I think you're making for other people, and that's different than making for yourself. It's a different kind of stress relief. It's a different kind of creativity,
Yeah, it's a fine line there, because I do believe in artists being paid for their art.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that you have to be paid for your art for it to be valued. Exactly. And it's just everyone's different and your circumstances are different.
Yeah.
And it's tricky there. Mm-hmm. I know I've always loved photography, but when I started doing wedding photography, it put all this pressure on it. Right. It felt really heavy. Yeah. And so that wasn't the right fit for me. Right. I kind of pivoted away from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So you seem really kind of thoughtful and intuitive and very like intentional with all of your choices.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. I feel like I overload myself all the time, but I appreciate that it looks like intention on the outside.
Well, just talking about like choosing your major and these things, you went through a lot of thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's true.
So I'd love to go back to that and talk a little bit about your college experience.
Yeah. My undergrad. Okay. Yeah. Um, it was a lot. It was a lot of work. It was great. It was a lot. I like just tend to put a lot of like academic pressure on myself. So it's like a lot especially when you're in an arts program, it's very hard to draw a line between, very hard to decipher whether you're making that piece of art because it speaks to you as a creative or if you're making it to get a good grade. It's like my first 2 years were trying to navigate that strange wheelhouse because I was like very intent on doing well. But anyways, eventually you kind of figure it out. But it was a lot of work. It was great. I just feel like I learned so many new things and it just felt like my brain was stretched all the time. Like coding was like a really steep incline, like really, really steep incline. And the cool part about that, I've taught that same class that I learned how to code with now, like, I don't know, 6 years later, I taught that class to the undergrad program that I attended. So it was kind of like a full circle experience. But yeah, it's really hard. Coding is really hard, but it's really fun once you do it. And I think the coding that we did in our undergrad was really captivating because it was a visual output based coding language. So everything was for the intention of creating something that you could see or hear or touch. So we would code for robotics, and then we would have like little robots that like ran across the room and things like that. And we would code for animations on the screen and stuff. And so that stuff was really compelling to me as like a person who was really passionate about art. So I think that really carried me through. I would be curious to know how it would have gone if that was like a coding language that was not for the output of visuals. It would have been very different. But I really liked it. Robotics was so fun. All of those things I thought I would like, but I ended up really loving. Wearables is super fun because my mom, as your mom said, you said as well, she loved to sew, and so when we worked in wearables, it was like the first time that I had seen these intersections of what I had already loved and what I newly have acquired. So that was really cool to put sensors and conductive wire and things like that into things you could wear. That was really cool. Yeah, it was great. I loved it. In my third year, I had this really cool opportunity. There was this tiny, tiny festival called Mini Maker Faire. And for anyone listening who's familiar with Maker Faire now at the reference library, it's like 200,000 people come and it's huge. But there was like maybe 2,000 people who came to the very first one in Toronto. And it was like the first one in Canada. And my third year professor basically demanded that I put my project in. It was this keyboard. When you pressed the keys, it emitted the sound of a word from Barack Obama's inauguration speech. It was very timely. He had just been elected for the first time, which was really meaningful to me as like a multiracial, but optically Black woman of color. So this keyboard, you could compose your own Barack Obama speech, basically. It was like a political statement piece, but I put it into the Toronto Maker Faire. And so like 2,000 people were there over the course of 3 days, which is not a lot of people, but it felt really big, and really exciting. It was the first time I'd put my work anywhere. Anyway, so Make Magazine, which if you're part of like maker culture is like a big deal. It's kind of like the Vogue of maker culture. They were there and they loved it and asked me to go to the Detroit Maker Faire. And so my family and I packed this project up and took this trip to Detroit. And it was really like Detroit was at the time really run down, like really, really run down. So it was a bit of a experience. But we went all the way down to the Henry Ford Museum, put it on display there. It got all this notoriety. The Henry Ford Museum of Maker Faire, like the Detroit version, is like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people go, like 400,000 people go in 2 days. Like it's insane. And because Barack Obama had just gotten elected, everyone wanted to have like a conversation about it. Everyone was confused as to why I was Canadian and even knew about this, which is like kind of troubling to think that Americans were like, what?
It's because Americans are so insular. Exactly. We only see our own country. When I went to grad school in London, I was like, wow, people are aware of the world.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. Yeah, they were like, wait, why are you Canadian? I don't understand. How did you hear about Barack Obama? And I'm like, pardon me? What are you saying? I don't understand. But anyway, so yeah, it got like editor's choice at that festival, which is like super awesome. And then like Barack Obama's like media team featured it on the White House website, which was like super dope. And then there was like all these different radio shows that I talked to all around the curiosity of being a Canadian, really, who was interested in politics that were American. But it was really cool. It was like a launching point, or like a trampolining some of my work into the world, which I'm really grateful to my undergrad for. But yeah, it was.
Right. And for anyone who's curious, there's a video of that on your website.
Oh,
so
thanks.
I'll put that in the show notes. I'm not sure you've described what it
okay.
What it did.
So it was a Casio keyboard, like an ordinary keyboard that you might have as like a preteen in your home. But I hacked the internals so that when you press a key, instead of the sound of the note playing through the speakers, a word from Barack Obama's inauguration speech would play. So each one of the keys, both black and white, were all tied to like campaign or election or like democracy. And you could, and then there were like smaller words in between as well. So you would have the and things like that, all in Barack Obama's eloquent voice. And so I would take his speeches and chop them all up and then like put those sound bites to each key so that an individual who played the keyboard could compose their own speech, which I thought would be most interesting to adults. But like, as many things in that kind of time bracket showed, like that project was the most compelling to kids who seemed to have like the least context for it. But it was like really interesting, which kind of inspired a lot of my work with kids moving forward. But yeah, so that's how the project worked. It was like an entirely like code-based hack of like a electronic that you can buy from the store.
So let's kind of jump from that into your instructing and your teaching. Yeah,
so I worked with kids for many years, like 5 years, maybe something like that. But yeah, I started by working at this company. They're now called Little Robot Friends, which is really great because they have this little robot that you can buy to teach your kids how to code. But originally their company name was Aesthetic, and they did interactive installations for museums and galleries. And so I worked with them, and they got this contract from TIFF to do this cool kids project, this 50 years of Bond spy making project. So you'd be like at the studio. We made all of these. This was like my first proper job out of undergrad, but we made these little Arduino based spy devices to catch thieves and criminals and things like that. They were like little Arduinos that had like sirens that would go off, or like a net that would fly out, or things like that.
So what is an Arduino?
Oh yeah. So an Arduino is a microcontroller. It's like a brain of your computer, but this one is user-friendly in that you can plug it into your laptop or PC, I guess, and then you could just code it and upload this code. And now the code lives on this little microchip, and that microchip can be the brain of a little robot that you make. Or it could be the brain of like a watering system for your plants. It's really like a microchip that controls motors, gears, sensors, lights, things like that.
Cool. So they were making little spy devices.
Yeah, they were so cute. So you can get Arduinos that are really, really tiny. So we made ours inside of Altoid tins. So we took our Arduino, we put it inside of an Altoid tin, and then we had these jacks that you could plug in other sensors or sirens or like nets or things like that. So we pre-coded the Arduinos, and then we taught the kids how to code in the workshop. So this was all like what we did as a studio for TIFF to carry on as an educational package. So we made these cute little kits in Altoid tins, and they were so jazzed about it, but they couldn't find anyone to teach it. And so they asked the studio if they knew anybody that could teach it. And the studio was like, oh, well, Ashley's here. She's interested in working with kids. And like, she built these with us, like she could teach it. And so then I went on to teach these fun spy devices workshops for TIFF for like a year and some amount. Like, it was really popular. So it outlasted the TIFF exhibition, the James Bond 50 Years of Bond exhibition, and was continued to run after that for like a good like maybe 7 or 8 months. And so I taught that workshop there. And then shortly after my first few weeks there, I got hired part-time by Girls Learning Code to run their first iterations of their girls program. So I suppose this was Ladies Learning Code deciding that they wanted to run a girls division. And so I got hired by them. And so I ran their first 2 years of girls programming. So simultaneously to working at TIFF and at Aesthetic. I was working so many jobs at that time of life. I did a little freelance for like Maker Kids as well. It was just like a really hot time of the history of Toronto for kids education in its grassroots form. So lots of people like myself were working in lots of different places because there were very few of us who had the skill, and a lot of places who wanted to try and teach this stuff to kids. So I don't remember ever really doing anything else but work in those like 2 years. I did like a ton of work, but it was cool. So yeah, after that, I like started my own kids program and continued working for all those places, but like ran my own kids program called Spark Makers. I also had like a subset of that called Byte. It was basically, the idea was to teach young people of color how to code. And so we got swept up by Google for a little bit and got to like tour with them as they did their 1 year of Google Geek Street, which was when Google took over a street in Toronto. It was in the Distillery District. And they put up all these booths, and for a day kids could come, or for a weekend rather, kids could come and like learn how to code or learn how to 3D print or work with robotics. So Spark Makers got to be alongside that for a while, which was fun. And then we got some funding and went to a technology festival in Johannesburg, South Africa, and taught a whole bunch of kids in Johannesburg how to code and how to work with robotics, and that was super cool too. So I think that's everything. All of those things, like there was just so many opportunities to work with kids and coding at that time. It was just great. But yeah, in a very short period of time, I had taught like several thousand kids how to code, which was really, really empowering.
So what is TIFF?
The Toronto International Film Festival, they have a permanent location at John and King Street. They have like the TIFF Bell Lightbox there, and they run constant films and film festivals, but they also have a large subset of their staff that work in new education. So they do film education workshops, but they also have this what I think is really innovative, this like subset of their education that's all about like coding and technology. And so that's the department that I worked at for TIFF. So there weren't a lot of people doing it at the time.
Cool. So one of the things I saw in leading up to talking to you that you shared on Instagram stories, you were having kids take technology apart.
Oh yeah. I work at Ryerson currently. I've worked there for a few years. That's where I manage a makerspace. And that's also where I currently teach robotics and coding and fabrication to undergrads. So the same program that I graduated from, which is kind of nice. And so the class that I taught in the winter semester of this year, where you saw that Instagram story, was called Making Objects. It was so fun. It's the best class. It's like 55 students in 2 sections, and you learn how to work with power tools. You learn how to 3D print, laser cut. You learn how to build things, like what type of glue you'd use. Like there's all kinds of like 3D modeling curriculum as well. But that day was particularly special because it's called Break Something Day. And so students bring in something that they found at like a thrift store, maybe in their parents' basement, and they bring it in and we break it up. And at this point, these students have had a few years of electronics education and this class. So the idea is to see how this thing is made, what comprises these objects. And really, truthfully, the larger goal is to like break this black box mentality. A lot of our technology comes in these sealed compartments, which like in the academic world, we talk about as like black box. And so it creates this illusion that technology or that electronics are magic, and that like you don't have the capacity to understand them. Like I'm looking at my iPhone and my Mac laptop right now, and there's no indication of how this thing works. You can't see anything. And Apple has done a lot to like even revert down to like more and more streamlined designs, which is beautiful, but also challenging as a person who's trying to inspire youth to be producers of technology rather than consumers of technology exclusively. So anyways, they loved it. They like smashed all these things apart. Some of them brought in like all old kids' toys. Like there was this horrifying one. It's like this, I genuinely don't know what this toy is, but it's like this animated thing with like ears and like silicone skin, and it's green and it's got these LED screen eyeballs, and it says all these phrases, and you're supposed to like push it like a Furby, and it's supposed to do all these things. So the first thing these kids did, these students, these undergrads did, was rip all the skin off, which was traumatizing. I can send you photos. It is literally the scariest thing you'll ever see. It haunts me to this day. Sometimes it will just pop up as a memory, like, hey, my iPhone will be like 3 months ago, you had this photo. I'm like, blah. Like it's like so, it's very alarming. So, so yeah, I'll send you. It's terrifying. But anyway, so they ripped the skin off, which just left these like eyes and this like fur. It was horrible. And then it's still writhing around because it's like picking up on all your senses. But they loved it, and they were like, hey, this is a button. Hey, this is like a pressure sensor. Look at this. And they're like in love with this grotesque activity. But some of our students took apart like old film cameras, which are beautiful, old projectors. Those are so pretty. If you can ever take apart a camera or projector, it is full of aesthetically gorgeous things: lenses, prisms, gels, colored glass. Like they are gorgeous. Like you're pulling out bits of an old camera and every single piece is like pristine copper, and it looks like pieces of jewelry you'd want to wear. Like how you would fathom it so you didn't just look like you were wearing a like sheet of junk. I don't know, but like everything looked really gorgeous. But it was super fun, and it's really inspiring for them to see things like largely almost everything they saw inside of those objects they had seen in class before. And so I think that's really empowering as a person who's trying to be a prominent maker, or a prominent designer, or a prominent electronic fabricator, to see that like the stuff you have held in such high esteem is not too far from what you're capable of building right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm getting a very kind of Mythbusters, Adam Savage vibe. Yeah. We show a lot of, I've in my, more so in my kids workshops than in my adult. Kids are super into Mythbusters. Undergrads feel like they're in this space where it's like they're too cool for Mythbusters. I don't know. I think they're really cool. But when I taught kids a lot more in the past, we used to look at a ton of Mythbusters, especially when Adam Savage would do those inspiring talks at maker fairs all over the world. Like that, like I think he's spot on in some of his explorations. So we looked at a lot of that stuff. And there's a new Mythbusters Junior series coming out.
I know. It's pretty cool. Very exciting.
So I have so many different things to talk to you about. So we'll try not to go on too long. We'll just have to have you back in the future for another episode. But I like what you said about being a Jane of all trades. Because I've recently kind of rebranded myself as a Renaissance woman.
Oh, I like that phrase too.
Because there's such a negative connotation to doing. I kept trying to specialize. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a professional photographer, or a professional writer, or a professional filmmaker, or everything with the word professional in front of it, which is part of why I love your story of your parents. And I just kept burning out because when I would focus on one thing, it stifled my creative curiosity.
Right.
And so I love that phrase too, the Jane of all trades. How did that come about? How long have you been calling yourself that?
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe since like 2010, maybe something around there. Because I had to figure out some kind of title when the whole notoriety came around the Obama board, and
right.
I had to come up with some kind of title, and nothing was common back then. Like the title of maker was not common back then. It was like, this was before Toronto had any maker spaces that were widely utilized. This was like back when we just had like Hack Lab and Site 3, but those were like at the time really niche communities. Like even as a person who had an undergrad with the whole avenue of making, I felt very intimidated to go into those spaces. So this was like early days. So being a generalist was not common, and like I don't even think really embraced, but like I had to do all this defining so that I could be in all these things, and it was hard to determine how to describe myself. And I feel like I just got really frustrated and was just like, I'm just like a jack of all trades. And then I hated the male avenue of that.
Right.
So my middle name is Jane too. So it kind of like all went hand in hand. But yeah, I think probably since like maybe 2010, maybe 2012, something like that. But it's still like really new. Like it's like people still question me about it, I guess. Like when I got, it was super sweet. One of the women whose daughter I used to teach at Girls Learning Code, she nominated me for the Top 100 Black Women to Watch in Canada award. And so in that instance, which was far more recent, 2016, I had to define what I was, and I wanted to use Jane of all trades. And they were like, I don't know if this is a thing. And I'm like, this is what I would like to be called. I don't know. But yes, I still think that there's like some kind of confusion around being a person who wants to be a Renaissance woman, as you've said, which I've called myself as well. I love that one as well. But, it doesn't really matter because it's what makes you happy. Like myself, as well as what you've described, it's like to settle on one thing is a faster way to burn out, to be honest, for me. Like I need the multifaceted life, and it sounds like you do as well.
So let's go back to the project you're working on right now with the data weaving. I'd love to hear more.
Sure.
What data are you weaving and how does that work?
Truthfully, I'm still figuring it out. It's a real early work in progress. Right now, I have a practice piece that I'm weaving just to like familiarize myself with the stitches. So it's like this loom, like though I've done weaving before in like Girl Guides and stuff. First of all, that was ages ago. And second of all, it was like on a piece of cardstock, like 5 inches by 5 inches.
Right.
But I built a loom. I built a 4.5 foot by 4.5 foot loom. This is really big.
It is. I've seen that on your Instagram too.
Yeah, it's really big. Like It's adjustable. Standing height, it is my height. I'm nearly 6 feet tall. So it's like, it's big. So I'm like practicing how to fill a space like that, given that that's like 18 times as big as I've ever woven before. But yeah, so after my practice piece, I'm going to weave data. And so right now, and in the next ideally 2 years of my master's, I would really like to focus on the intersection of technology and culture. And I specifically like to explore Afrofuturism, which is lots of things, but in my ambition, it's like using technology to inspire people of color in a creative way to pursue technology. And so my thoughts around those are like, I guess there's just so many ways to approach something like that. But data weaving to me is a really interesting intersection that fits nicely into Afrofuturism because it is both using technology to reach new audiences, but it's applying like a folk-oriented or a traditionally oriented skill set to acquire that final piece. So I think right now is really fun because I'm not just practicing the stitches, but I'm also learning about how people of color have worked with textiles to convey information before. So for instance, in some African culture, there's information about your family heritage, about like where you're from, all woven into a pattern on your clothes. Even in Scottish heritage recently, my grandmother was Scottish partially, and so we like were part of the McGregor clan. And so the tartan itself also like represents like your area of where you're from. So like if you were to die in war, your body would be brought back to where you were originally born to be reunited with your family. There's in almost every culture a heritage of like how information is conveyed in textiles. And so that's really interesting to me as a person who uses data and codes with data, but also loves to sew and work with textiles and be a more like a maker of different kinds of a different variety. Anyways, this is a long-winded explanation, but not as long-winded, more long-winded rather than I had hoped. But basically, I'm taking, I don't know, I have like 4 or 5 different sets of data, but it is about people of color. I have a data set about people of color, and I'm weaving that into a textile, which means that you take parts of that data and then you determine that like all data in this category will be represented by, let's say, knots of this color. All data of this category will be represented by lengths of string in this color. All data of that category will be represented by like a pattern that looks like this. So it's kind of a weird way to experience it because we don't often see our data in the raw. We see our data in a visualization already. So it's kind of hard for me to explain it.
So is it down to the ones and the zeros?
Yeah, exactly. So it's taking those ones and those zeros and it's conveying them in a way that's visually interesting. So oftentimes we see data represented in like infographic is a really simple way to explain it, rather than an infographic to display it in a textile, in a big woven sheet. And so that woven sheet at first glance looks like a design. And then afterwards you realize it's a depiction of information, which is, I think, really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. I'm really excited to see how it progresses.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm hoping it goes well too.
I'm sure it will. You're in that beginning stage where it's all very ephemeral, but...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's going to be fun. What's been really fun about it is that like it's in the makerspace that I work in. It's huge structure. Makerspace taking up far too much space, but there's like only a couple handfuls of students, like maybe 20 students who have access in the summer. But they're the curious kind, the really, really curious kind, which is great. And so it's just been so great to have these conversations about data and textiles with like people like 8, 9, 10 years younger than me, and talking about like data representation and like, having like really mindful conversations about data and data sharing and how you can work with new innovative ways to reclaim that data. It's been really great having those conversations. So far, that's been my favorite part, and a couple of them want to build looms now, so that's fun.
Cool. So something that's come up a lot that people might not be familiar with is the makerspace.
Yeah.
So for someone who's never heard of that and maybe would like to see if there's one in their area or just wonders what it is, maybe you can describe that for us.
Yeah, so a makerspace is a place that typically has technology, but more importantly has a community of individuals who like to make things. And that make things definition is quite broad. Most of the makerspaces in North America are open to making as it's defined by maybe sewing, maybe woodworking, maybe metalworking, oftentimes coding technology, 3D printing. I know there are lots of makerspaces that are interested in ceramic work. It's like they're looking for Jane and Jacks of all trades, and they're looking for those people who are specialists. It's basically like, do you like to work with your hands in some way? Then this is the place for you. It's a really cool opportunity to be immersed in a community of people who are just as passionate about things as you are. And so in Toronto right now, we are just like flooded with makerspaces, which is great. And in a lot of North America, really, there's tons of makerspaces. Even in the Yukon, they have these makerspaces in shipping containers and stuff, which is really fun. So I think like the coolest part about this is that it's had this great intersection with education, as people have learned that do-it-yourself processes build these avenues to being better at math and art and science and technology in high schools and elementary schools. And so the Toronto Public Library, the Reference Library, for instance, has its own makerspace, and many, many libraries across North America have acquired funding to have makerspaces of their own. So you don't even have to go into an unfamiliar space. It could just be your local library that you've probably been to before.
Cool. So there's one about maybe 45 minutes from us that's not called a makerspace, but it basically is what you're describing. And you've got me all excited. I haven't been to it yet. And so I've got to go check it out.
Yeah, you should go. Yeah, that's great. You should totally go. Yeah, they come in all kinds of different, labelings. Sometimes they're called like explore spaces. Sometimes they're called like labs.
Yeah, I think this one's a fab lab.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we have a fab lab on campus too. So yeah, that's a pretty popular name that's coming around. People can't use the same name for too long, right? They want to be inventive and use their own name, and then that catches on and we have to change it again. And
So that's cool.
Yeah.
I love how you're interested in technology, which is very new. And then you're interested in this baking and food fermenting, which is very old.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I think it's like really what's really exciting about being interested in old forms of making and new forms of making is that you realize how much one it has informed the other. So for instance, like the things I was talking about around like information in textiles, I don't know, like when you look at some of these old forms of creating, those are the things that developed the opportunity for us to create digital code. These messages in other encryptions, that is code. So for instance, in the women's suffrage movement, one of my favorite stories is that it used to be like illegal and also like quite frowned upon within the family for women to gather, to congregate around revolution and like, anchoring momentum for the right to vote. And so women would encode messages in recipes inside of cookbooks and then give these cookbooks to their neighbors with like decryptors and things like that. And like,
wow.
This is like a specific language of the woman at the time, right? If you think about it, not to think about like, remove all the sexism of that phrase currently, but at
right.
that time, cookbooks are not something that men are looking in. They're not something that kids are looking in. This is a vehicle of information for the female form. So what an incredible revolutionary tactic to use code, so not technological code, but coded messages to communicate to other women about how to strike up momentum for women's suffrage. Like, that's, in my opinion, the coolest. That's like super cool, right? Super, super cool. And nobody can read it. Like, it's weird, right? And that's code. That is what code is. And so, like, regardless of the individual who developed coding languages, that is inarguably true that digital code was informed by analog code, and analog code was things like messages encrypted in cookbooks, or messages and information in your tartan or in your clothing to denote your status, or even in particular bits of symbols scratched onto posts along the Underground Railroad for people of color to know where was safe and where specifically wasn't safe. That's code, you know? So for me, I feel like it's like the most fascinating thing is seeing one consistently inform the other. When you know enough about the old versions of making and the cultures that develop those versions of making. So for me, a lot of that is like women and women of color and people of color. Then you recognize that these little tidbits of the coding languages and the coding processes that you work on now are all connected to little tiny threads of the past, you know, which I think is really thrilling, really exciting, sometimes a bit of a solo excitement because I don't necessarily have like a huge community of people who are super aware of these things. But yeah, I think that they're super interconnected, and the latter would not exist without the former, realistically. Like, look into some examples of how Morse code was formed. Like, if you look into, like, you know, that the first, I mean, maybe people still don't know this, but the first coders at all were women. It was like a woman's job. Like, you weren't allowed to like work in military forms and stuff. So you had to do these like low level coding jobs. Like, who was to think that decades later coding would be such a relevant importance in our life? But yeah, even just like the development of like Morse code, like some of these things were developed based on systems that women and people of color used for communication in history. I just think it's fascinating. You know, I don't see them as too unrelated. I think it's like quite compelling to know about both and to use both to create work now is very innovative. I think in a way that speaks to me like personally, and I don't know, maybe others, but it's exciting to me.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Now I'm curious about that cookbook code stuff.
I know, isn't that cool?
I'll have to look into that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really cool.
So what kind of things have you done food fermenting?
So I took my favorite classes at George Brown were the fermentation classes. I think they were taught by the best, like zaniest of the instructors at George Brown, which were my favorite. So I've done a lot of like foraging since I left the Yukon. So like fermenting like garlic scape and things like that, things that are easy to forage. It's hard to forage in Ontario, but in the Yukon you can forage all sorts of interesting things. I have made a lot of jams and jellies out of like locally sourced berries and like spruce tips and things like that, which is really fun. It just seems like, truthfully, like an endless array of things you can ferment. My friend and I, we're actually just closing this company now, but for 4 years we had a company that was all around the discovery of like alcohol and like how to like pair food with beer, and we spent a lot of time making our own beer, which was super fun. That was like a really fun, like super labor intensive version of fermenting. It was called Detox Retox. We ran these like yoga and beer sessions all over the city. They were super fun. But she has Make Lemonade now, the co-working space, and I am moving to New York, so we have to close that company. But yeah, so the winemaking and the beer making were my favorite. My old apartment used to have this grapevine trellis in our backyard, owned by the people who owned our home, obviously. Husband and a wife who, while I was living there, got divorced and couldn't determine what they were going to do with the grapevines. And so they just gave me grapes year after year because they couldn't sort it out. It wasn't like legally confirmed what could happen with the grapes. So they just gave them to me so I would make wine out of them, which would always go disastrously awry. Like I had once this like 4-gallon like wine jug in my kitchen fermenting. And we didn't have air conditioning, and we had a thunderstorm. And so the air pressure went like super, super high up. And at work, for some reason, I was like, I hope the wine is okay. And when I got home, it had reached such a high level of pressure that the whole like the whole airlock, the system, the whole cap had flown off, and it had like ejected wine all over my ceiling, like everywhere. It was like dripping all over my white ceiling, all over the walls, on the fridge, on the floor, on the table, on the couches. And I was like, oh my God, it was horrible. So I had to like spend 4 hours trying to get it out of everything. It didn't come out of everything, and I never told my roommate at the time, and she never noticed, which is great, but it was horrifying.
That sounds like an Anne of Green Gables worthy story.
It was a nightmare, like a huge, I had to call in sick to work. I was like, I can't come in, I have wine everywhere. They're like, what are you talking about? Yeah, it was really rough. It was the worst fermentation experience so far, but it was funny in hindsight.
Yeah, I am just beginning to dabble in trying to learn to make a shrub.
Oh, cool.
So I had one, there's a bakery here that had a Jane Austen dinner in winter, and he made all the historical foods, and the shrub was so good. Cool. But when I tried to make it, it tasted nothing like his. And apparently there's lots of different ways to do it. So I need to like put it on a microcosm, like a little science experiment, make each little jar different and see which one tastes the way I like.
Yeah. Isn't that fun? Trying to mimic a recipe. Super fun. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think like shrubs are really fun. I think like the grossest but most exciting, most sciencey fermentation is like working with scobies. They're like the fleshy bacteria culture that allows you to brew kombucha. They're hideous. They look like enormous disc-shaped slugs. They are so hideous, but they're super, super cool scientifically, and like working through the exploration of how to create like fermented, like effervescent, bubbly beverages with them is like super, it's like wild. It's crazy fun, really, really fun, but gross.
I actually just saw one for the first time on social media yesterday, and I was like, what is this? Yeah,
it's trauma. It's traumatic to see. It's really traumatic. Like, audience beware. If you Google SCOBY, just beware. You have to be prepared to see what it looks like. It's disgusting.
So we've talked about this a little bit, but I'll ask you again in case you have more to say on it. So how does curiosity play a part in your creativity?
It's a hard question to answer, really, because I don't see them in my life as different at all. I think that like I would have no creativity if I didn't have curiosity. I think that like everything that I use as a part of my creative mediums and our creative practice is driven by like a long pipe dream curiosity of information I'm trying to seek. So I think that curiosity is the reason why I'm creative. I think it always has been. And I think sometimes, and this is an unfortunate characteristic, sometimes when I feel like I've learned everything I can about a subject matter, I'm over it, like it's done, you know? And so that's like difficult for like long-term creativity on an object. Like I'm talking about stuff that I've worked on for like 6 years or 5 years. And I'm like, I think I know it all. I think I know everything that I could seek without stumbling upon some kind of wizard who held more information. And so at that point, I'm like, usually my go-to is to be like, and on to the next interest, you know? So I think that the curiosity really drives the creativity. And luckily, we are living in an age where like we have such access to information that like those experiences come around like pretty infrequently, and then they resurge, right? So you think you know everything about, let's say, weaving as a kid, and then 20 years later you're like, oh, I like to weave again, you know? So I think the curiosity is what makes the creativity flow. And just knowing what I dislike about work, for instance, what I procrastinate about work, it's usually the stuff that doesn't have any creative or any curious drive behind it. You know, the things that I'm really like gung-ho passionate about in my home practice, in my work practice, in my academic practice, those are without a doubt like curiosity driven.
That reminds me of a conversation I had with my friend Chris with a K. She teaches online writing courses, and we're both very curiosity driven, but we've went through some of these online business training where you're supposed to make one thing and sell it over and over and over.
Right.
And that didn't fit for either of us because we make it. We're like, okay, I'm done. I'm done with that. Now I want to make something new.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds totally in line with what my life has been like too. I'm like, okay, like that's enough of that. Like I've already done that once. It's time to stop.
I'm ready to learn the new thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So what else fascinates you?
So I really love politics, which we talked about a little bit. I really love like the ethics and the lack of ethics usually, but I really love politics. Oftentimes like more American focused politics than Canadian focused politics, only because I feel like they have far more to do with diversity than Canada ever really talks about. Canada politics could use a big dose of like, focus on diversity, but it's not a thing at the moment, truthfully. So I think that American politics have always been really interesting to me. Local politics are really fun too, or interesting as well. I think that there's just like so many things that are intersecting with politics right now. Particularly technology is intersecting a lot with political stances and ethics at the moment. The like Shopify debacle that happened like last winter that I was a part of, they had just recently been kind of like outed to be the platform that Breitbart uses to sell like hateful merchandise around like, women and people of color and people who are of different sexualities as well. And so the internet demanded Shopify take this website down, or at least like update their policies and procedures to say like, you should not use this medium to be hateful. And so anyways, they said no. Long and short of it, they said no. And there's lots of reasons for that. And there's lots of reasons why that's a bad thing, in my opinion. Anyways, just around that time, there was this Women in Tech event that asked me to sit on the panel. And so they were hosting at Shopify. Shopify was one of their leading partners. And so I said I would not do it. Like, I won't be a part of anything related to a company that is like outwardly acknowledging their contribution to hateful circumstances and determining that it does not apply to them ethically. Anyway, so it like launched this huge social media thing, and Huffington Post wrote about it, Metro Toronto, Metro Ottawa, talking about the idea that a company needs to be on the right side of history. And lots of other companies, for instance, Airbnb, who had so many problems regarding race and racism around their like the ability for a person of color or even like a gay couple to be able to rent in a space. It was like very difficult. And so they updated their policy. They acknowledged the issue, updated their policies and procedures, and launched this whole ad campaign around why it's important for Airbnb to be used in an ethical way, in a way in which like anyone can rent. And that's like a lot of, doing the work. That's a lot of the responsibility that comes with having a platform that reaches the masses. Spotify also decided to take down a whole bunch of artists that had been accused of like pedophilia and all of these things like that, like really deciding that they wanted to represent a world in which people were treated like people and that you weren't attributing to hateful organizations. To me, those whole intersections of like ethics and the ripple effect of politics and technology are really, really interesting to me. And like I've had a lot of great opportunities to speak in that regard. And like that whole stance that I took with Shopify is a large reason why I got into this very coveted master's program. So I think it's like, which I didn't know at the time, obviously I hadn't even applied, but turns out to be quite a contributing factor. But yeah, it's just like, activism and technology have these really great Venn diagram overlaps, which I've always tried to like play in the margins of.
So let's talk a little bit about your grad program.
So my grad program is at NYU in the Tisch School of the Arts, which is like very applicable to the things that I've liked to do in the past. And it's a program called ITP. It's a really small program. It gets like a lot of applications every year. It stands for Interactive Telecommunications Program. So founders of Arduino have graduated from that program. A lot of really prominent programming languages that people have used to create open source opportunities for individuals to learn how to code, processing being one of them, graduated from this program. Some of the people that are locally important to us, like CBC's Ramona Pringle, she's a technology columnist. She graduated from that program as well. So it's in Manhattan, like right on Broadway. They work in technology with the output of creativity, like sometimes art, sometimes just like design, sometimes social creativity and social arts. And their whole objective is to change the world. So that's the program that I'm headed to rather in September. So I'm just like trying to close up all these ties that are here and pack it all up and move to New York for 2 years at least and see how that goes.
Cool.
Yeah.
So if someone wanted to dabble in coding for the first time, where would they start?
In coding for the first time, yeah, I think there's lots of really great places to start. I think it depends on who you are. If you're a social learner, I would say that you should go to a workshop or a class for beginners. And depending on where you live, there can be lots of them. I know if you wanted to make a special trip to Toronto, or if you live near another major city like Montreal or Vancouver, they have lots of them at makerspaces. There's also places like Bitmaker and things like that teach them on this, like that's their whole objective, is to just teach coding workshops. And so you could go and take an introductory class there. There's also so much information online, so much information. So Arduino is a really fun place to start. It sounds like it's advanced, but there are so many fun beginner workshops. And the great part about Arduino is that they have an enormously advanced online forums and communities that have basic like coding samples that you can take and run right away. So you have to do almost no no coding yourself. You can just drag, drop, upload, and see like lights blink or like a sensor work and things like that. And it's really well described. Adafruit is a website that sells these things and also produces online content for people to use. And so that's a really fun place to start as well. They've got like a lot of modern applications, like they'll look at what's trending in society and then try to build a tutorial for people to make their own version of that right now. So that's really a cool place to start too. And makezine.com also has just maybe the longest archive of tutorials and coding samples to work with. So all of those places would be fun. But I think it's like starting with a project is really the best way to go about it, because you feel really accomplished when you get to the end of it. And that's a really great motivator, right? To be able to like say like, I made this and now I'm going to go figure out how it works, like you can use the tutorial to make it. And then you get to, in that instance along the way, figure out how it works and how you could add to it, or maybe just move on to a new project. But project-based learning has been really successful for a lot of my students. So maybe that would be a good opportunity for beginners.
If you have time, I have one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, no problem.
So I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, but I think I have a lot of parents that watch. So if you wanted to talk about kids getting into coding, especially girls.
Yeah, girls in coding. I think it's like important. I think it's very, very important for women I was going to phrase things one way, but I actually see it as like kind of a yin and yang. I think it's really important for girls to see representations of themselves, representations of women who do the things that they do, largely women who look like them. I just feel like it's been the most successful version of inspiration. So if a young girl sees a woman working in technology or code or like electronics or robotics who looks like them, they will be more inclined to see that as a possibility for their future. I also think it's really important for women to work with young women and teach these things to them, because I think it brings together a missing piece of the past. I don't think a lot of women I know had female role models growing up to aspire to be like in terms of coding or technology specific. Many of us had female role models who were like gung-ho. To have a woman in your life who's doing what you want to do and technology is very rare. Like I've had the privilege of knowing lots of women in tech, and many, many, many of them, I would say close to 75% of them, did not have a female role model in tech to aspire to be like. They were kind of navigating that roadmap for themselves, or even just like en masse with the momentum of the city. And I think it's like really important for us to close that emotional gap for ourselves and pass the torch down to younger generations, I think it makes us feel like we are now solving that issue that we had for ourselves. So yeah, I think just having taught so many youth to code, it's really helped me come to terms with like that kind of like, it was like so beneficial in lots of ways, but that challenging navigational path where you had to at all times tell yourself that you belong, even though you're female, you know? I think that for parents who have young girls who want to learn how to work with electronics, robotics, or coding, try to find a place where there's at least one woman working there. And if she can be a woman who's kind of in charge, that's even better. But yeah, because it really makes a huge difference. It's an instant validator. That girl will not necessarily spend as much time wondering if this is right for them and spend more time wondering if they like it, you know, because not all people have to like technology. It's less internal identity crisis and more about like, do I like this or don't I like this, you know? So that's a good place to start, like just looking for makerspaces or workshops where women are present. And if you can find one where somebody looks like your little girl, then that's even better. But yeah, I think that that's really important. Just the female leadership in those spaces is really important for young girls when they're learning how to do this stuff.
So where's the best place to find you online? So
I'm on Instagram the most frequently. I'm on Twitter sometimes, but I like Instagram the best because I can share videos with a lot of ease of what I'm doing. And, you know, it's like easier to see progression of like an evolution of a project over time. So on Instagram and Twitter, you can find me at Ashley Jane Lewis. But if you want to reach me and have me respond, then Instagram is the place to go. You can DM me, or like I check the like DM requests all the time. I get lots of messages from people who I don't mutually follow, but then like it's great opportunities like this one to be able to have like a nice chat about what our mutual interests are.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This has been great.
Yeah, no problem.
Great to hobnob with another Renaissance woman.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to keep following your data weaving and your NYU journey and all of that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really liked chatting about it. Great questions. And yeah, it's nice to talk to somebody who likes to make a lot of things too. You get to like get right to the meat and potatoes of everything.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find the show notes at kindlecuriosity.com. This podcast is completely powered by Patreon. You can pledge as little as $1 a month to keep this podcast advert-free, or you can pledge $5 for the bonus podcast, Tea Time. You can also support the podcast by leaving a rating and review. This really helps other people to find the podcast. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram at Sarah D. Schatz. Feel free to tag me or pop over and introduce yourself. I love to connect to other curious souls. And a big thanks to all of my patrons. I couldn't do this without y'all. That's it for today's episode. I'll see you next time.